say what he wants to say. In the same spirit, he's asked me not to give a long introduction to his many positions and skills, and simply introduce him and the title of his talk, which will be Neurophenomenology, Gift and Responsibility.
Ladies and gentlemen, over these last 3 days, a strange thing has happened in this auditorium. Or perhaps for those of you who do interdisciplinary conferences frequently, it wasn't so strange at all. What we have seen sort of gently in the background, and sometimes not so gently, is a competition that has arisen between two distinct camps. In fact, that same distinct competition that I have seen at similar conferences over and over again over the last 15 years. The philosophers often joke, there are always 3-day conferences, scientists always present for the first 2, fly off on an airplane to the next conference, and a few philosophers and practitioners are left to fight over the scraps left in the auditorium. I would like to say in this closing talk, we should not ignore the tension or pretend it doesn't exist. It's time now to look it in the eye, as it were. So it would be comfortable for me to give you a scientific talk. It would be comfortable for me to give you a meditator's talk, a philosopher's talk. But I want to focus us on the area of discomfort, the area of the conflict. Can you who know how to sit with me with this conflict for the next 28.6 minutes? Can you learn to look at it with the fixed gaze of a practitioner and of a philosopher? And in order to do this, I'd like to focus your attention on one central term from today's topic, neurophenomenology. Obviously, the term seeks to draw together cognitive neuroscience and phenomenology, and as you know from the beautiful talk of Natalie, for example, philosophy is the study of the mental life as experienced, the thinker, the thinking, and the content of the thought. We've had several brilliant descriptions of Indian phenomenologies at this conference, but you see, already here, the conflict arises that we've observed over and over again at this conference. You see, scientists frequently respond that phenomenology is precisely the wrong discipline to pair with cognitive neuroscience, for phenomenology is based on the essential nature of the first-person perspective. In Husserl's classic formulation, it brackets out the natural attitude toward the world, and that means bracketing out the natural sciences as well. Phenomenologists like Husserl and Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty in the West have argued that one can see the essential features of an experience, eidetic seeing. And Indian meditators agree on many essential features of what is seen when we are looking within. But the neurosciences research brain structures and functions. The goal here is still to explain cognitive and affective experience, but the explanations now are given in terms of anatomical structures and patterns of neural firings. The only potential answers that are taken seriously are those that are determined by objective experimental methods, the ones that produce results that can be verified by any other expert in the field. Can you see the potential gulf between these two approaches? Can you sit with the tension that I've just described? Can you look at it with a steady gaze? For many, most, want the gulf simply to go away. If you don't look at it, it will disappear. And so they calmly argue for a unity of the two sides. without cognizing the difference, the conflict. They claim an easy equivalence between the two approaches, phenomenological or spiritual descriptions of consciousness on the one side, scientific descriptions of cognition or metacognition on the other side. We should be skeptical of such claims to have achieved unity. At most, I suggest, the language from the one side converges toward the language of the other in the way that an asymptotic curve converges toward, say, the y-axis without actually striking it. You see, many authors claim to have established the final convergence. So their asymptotic curve, 1 over x, intersects the y-axis, and the difference is abolished. But we should no more rush in to embrace their claims for success than we should identify that asymptote with the vertical axis. Max, this is my response, if we discuss it, to the free will question, that these orders of spontaneity or constraint are asymptotes, and we have to be careful about leaping too quickly to the connectures. And meditators so often say that the language we use to describe the ultimate experience is limited. It falls away like scales, not finally reaching its goal. That's asymptote. Do you understand? It's language that doesn't actually grasp the reality that has been experienced. Now, look what happens when you apply this asymptote, the asymptotic relationship, to today's key term, neurophenomenology. So you might think of the position I'm presenting now as both offering a gift and recognizing a responsibility. The gift is avoiding the reduction of lived experience. You see, our goal needs to be to preserve the validity of the individual quest for personal knowledge on the one hand, and the quest for scientific knowledge on the other. But the gift comes with a price. The price is responsibility. The responsibility is to acknowledge the difference between the kinds of tests that are scientific and the kinds of reasons, and they are reasons, that are not. In short, acknowledge the asymptote. It's hard for traditional philosophers to do this. In fact, my experience shows I'm unlikely to convince 56% of the audience of the point I've just made. But for that reason, I need to just mention a few examples of neural constraints on the mental life or on phenomenal experience. Think of this as the boot camp for philosophers and practitioners. This is the cost of admission, as it were, to any interdisciplinary discussion of consciousness. I hope the examples are known to you, so I just mention them in passing, but this is a lesson we can't let go of. Right, so you know the symptoms of Huntington's disease, jerky movements, dementia, personality change, and the like. But we know precisely the genetic defect that causes the production of the protein Huntington, particular defect, so that you have this repetition of this one strand many more times than on the average person. Neural difference manifest experiential difference. The famous examples from Oliver Sacks, right? For example, in visual agnosia, which is a lesion of the left occipital lobe and temporal lobes, and then we have these sorts of behavioral manifestations that occur. Alexia, or word blindness, in the case of this Howard Engel, the stroke had damaged the left visual cortex and the splenium of the corpus callosum, And then, so his brain could not differentiate the shapes that made up letters and words. So we have a behavioral, phenomenal manifestation with very specific damage, brain damage. People have spoken already of the Capgras syndrome, perceiving close family and friends as imposters. Achinotopsia is the neuropsychological disorder where one cannot perceive motion. We know it mostly from a subject whom we call LM. And we know where the lesions are on the posterior side of the visual cortex that lead to this failure of a cognitive ability. I love the case of Tommy McHugh, who, after a brain hemorrhage, became crazily creative, couldn't stop himself from painting and sculpting throughout the day. Creativity, artistic effusion from damage from that brain damage. Persinger's God helmet, actually a controversial case, it turns out. He applies these complex magnetic fields to the mesiobasal temporal lobes, and people have a spiritual experience. So he claims the replication failed in 2009. And then they use the terms that their culture trained them to use to describe what they saw or experienced. In the West, they say they experienced Elijah or Jesus or the Virgin Mary or Mohammed or the sky spirit. Some have Freudian interpretations, and some say that they have experienced an extraterrestrial intelligence who spoke with them. So again, we know exactly what's been applied to the brain, where, and we know the experience that changes as a result. You know that damage to the right parietal lobes can lead, in some cases, for people to score higher on the standard measures of spirituality. And we know what the right parietal lobe does in creating something which we would call highly spiritual, the sense of self. Right? This is boot camp. We have to acknowledge that these relationships exist. In this amazing study at Johns Hopkins University, where they took a synthetic experience in the context of a religious location, and people had powerful religious experiences lasting multiple hours. At the 6-month mark when tested, the large number, high majority of the subjects still said the experience was among the 3 most significant experiences of their lives through the administration of this particular substance. So, what do we conclude? Does neuroscience win and the spiritual traditions lose? No. It does not prove that consciousness is an epiphenomenon. For, as Carl Pribom writes, there are limits to understanding experience through observational and experimental analysis of behavior alone. And in the famous article by David Woodruff Smith, he notes, see that consciousness does not reduce to computation. Not all conscious activity is computation. Feeling dizzy, for example, is not computing. A certain form of computation is part of the neural activity that implements states of consciousness. But that's a different matter. There are certain things that reductive explanations cannot do. We have certain cognitive functions, and we have a number of experiential qualities which seem to resist this reductive explanation. And as David Zahavi says, we can establish that a certain function, if you turn it right way, it works. That a certain function is accompanied by a certain experience, but we have no idea why that happens. And regardless of how closely we scrutinize the neural mechanisms, we don't seem to be getting any closer to an answer. Or more briefly, our mental processes, which constitute our being and life, are not just abstract and mechanical, but personal as well. So, what is it that makes an experience conscious? Woodruff Smith argues that that is a combination of the qualitative character, reflexivity, which takes place within the intentionality of the conscious experience. Or, with Zahavi again, it's this first personal givenness that makes the experience subjective. The self, though, and here I do follow Evan Thompson, finally is the doer. It is this dual subjective sense of an inner plasticity, an inner purposiveness that we mean to indicate with the term spontaneity when we speak of conscious experience. What is it then that neurophenomenology could add to our discussion as we try to do an interdisciplinary bridging of this problem? Neurophenomenology, I understand, with Francisco Varela, as this quest to marry modern cognitive science together with a disciplined approach to human experience. The phenomenologists know about that disciplined approach to human experience. The cognitive neuroscientist knows what those standards are of modern cognitive science. But there's a huge resistance in the family to this wedding, right? The children may have to elope to pull this one off. Neurophenomenology, then, Varela argues, involves reframing the question to that, there we go again, of finding meaningful bridges between what two irreducible phenomenal domains. And by irreducible, I draw your attention again to the asymptote. The difference between them remains. We don't actually overcome it. But as in a marriage, the difference between the two partners does not prohibit common work together. The relationship remains asymptotic. The gap remains, and our goal is then to bridge the gap by trying to establish dynamic, reciprocal constraints. That's the key of the talk. Dynamic, reciprocal constraints between subjective experience and the neurobiology. Ladies and gentlemen, many have rushed in to close this explanatory gap. What they end up doing is short-circuiting the one side or the other. Short-circuiting the science, misrepresenting it, or short-circuiting the phenomenological side. Sometimes we give holistic answers where careful work in neurology is needed. That is, when we should have been doing the empirical work in cognitive science, studying these neural correlates of consciousness, sometimes we philosophers and meditators have substituted our own experiences and analyses as pseudo-scientific answers. Conversely, the neurophilosophers today make the equivalent mistake from their side. They pretend that descriptions of brain anatomy or neural firings answer core philosophical questions from across the world's traditions. And yet, in fact, they deal with the philosophical questions by eliminating them. I argue, following Varela, that phenomenology and cognitive neuroscience need to be pursued in such a way that they can become mutually constraining. Think about that. What's required to have mutual constraint? It means acknowledging the kinds of neural constraints that I covered earlier. And it also means seeking areas, examples, where brain functions are constrained by the self, by the person that you take yourself to be, together with your values and with your sense of purpose. And there are examples, many cases, where we recognize the constraints from the experienced self. Religious states produced intentionally that lead to different blood flow in the brain. Meditation intentionally practiced over long periods of time that lead to marked differences in brain firing. Some claim increases in gray matter. I actually think that this is empirically suspect, so I'll jump beyond that one. And elements of religious well-being, optimism, confidence, or faith that change the outcome in medical recovery, post-operative recovery. These are some of those cases. So in closing then, what follows from this approach? As a thought experiment, you skeptics in the audience who view me so skeptically now, imagine that we are able to find some cases of mutual constraint. Imagine that we can describe this bidirectional relationship. What might follow? Well, the situation, this difficult problem we're sitting with, remains difficult. Some would even call it desperate. Nobody has said the problem of the study of consciousness more clearly than Jerry Fodor. Nobody has the slightest idea how anything material could be conscious. Nobody even knows what it would be like to have the slightest idea about how anything material could be conscious. So much for the philosophy of consciousness. And yet, if we think of it not as identity, but in terms of overlap sets, in terms of even small areas where some constraints could be brought about between the two sides, maybe there are more optimistic possibilities. Mutual constraint is a goal that we can establish in interdisciplinary research if members from both sides are willing to accept the constraints from the discipline and the expertise of the other. As Sangeeta argues in a recent paper, the self and the brain mutually reinforce. We might say that to delimit the connections to wholly neurological, mental, or spiritual domains perhaps is putting the cart before the horse. The challenge then, as our conference brochure argued, is not one way, but two ways. The subjective self, through her experiences, values, attitudes, self-perceptions, can alter or influence neural changes to bring in qualitative progress in life. I think of it as a version of Dr. Srikantan's argument on Thursday to be patient with unsolved dualisms. Do you remember how he listed 6 or 8 dualisms, unsolved problems in physics, and the way that eventually one came to resolve them? So in interdisciplinary approaches to consciousness, we also have an unresolved conflict. To be interdisciplinary, then, requires us to find the mutual constraint, even though the data don't currently give us a solution. In closing, let me just note some examples of how this approach might affect our discussion of some of the enduring philosophical questions in a way that honors both sides of the discussion. Remember my point. The approach both offers a gift and recognizes a responsibility. The gift part is clear. This approach reinforces the language of phenomenal experience, it encourages philosophical reflection, and it preserves a role for the spiritual traditions. But the responsibility is to acknowledge the difference between the kinds of tests that are scientific and the kinds of reasons that are not, and to keep both of those in mind. So let's take the few examples. Self, soul, mind, psyche. such massive differences between traditions. The Christian seeks to mold herself to the person and nature of Jesus Christ, God become man. The Muslim seeks to live as God's vice-regent on earth, ruling over the animals, gaining knowledge of Him, of God, of the Almighty Allah, through Quran and through the world. And please, what is the self in Vedanta? There are dozens of views, materialist views, dualist views, Advaita, Vasishtadvaita, the list goes on, and then if you add the views of every particular scholar and guru, hundreds and thousands of positions, no? And then each practitioner has her own particular experiences, and they contribute to the particular way that she experiences selfhood. Self correlates with life world, Lebenswelt. Okay, any one of this myriad of views across the world's traditions can be taken as the independent variable, and we can study experiences and lifestyle effects as a dependent variable. Every meditator can try that, and virtually every observer can see behavioral differences or fail to see them. That's the kind of correlation in that direction. The scientific study takes the brain states as the independent variable and then looks at cognitive and phenomenal experience as the dependent variable. So there's the gift. Let's celebrate the variety of beliefs about selves, souls, and spirits. It's a rich ecosystem of experiences, beliefs, rituals, actions. At the same time, our responsibility is to acknowledge the difference between this sort of testing and the kind of scientific testing that genuine interdisciplinary work requires. Consciousness, the same two approaches. I had listed 26 definitions of consciousness that we've heard over the last 3 days. It's a bewildering myriad collection of inconsistent views. Consciousness is content. Consciousness is not content. Consciousness is self. Consciousness is not self. Consciousness is active. Consciousness is not active. It is, most speakers agreed, the source of meaning. It's what matters to us, and it's what does the mattering. Again here, however, the two approaches are possible. We can make phenomenal consciousness the dependent variable, or we can make it the independent variable. In closing, if this correlational method works, we have what we, or most of us, are looking for. We have the excitement of inner exploration, the phenomenal givens of consciousness. We have the reality of the inner self with its meanness, its values, and its sense of enduring identity. And we have the thrill of the scientific quest and the amazing data that it produces for us. In the entire world, the people we think of as most wasteful are the Americans. They take far more for themselves than the world has to give, consuming too many resources and leaving behind too much waste. The cohabitation of the scientific quest and the spiritual quest is possible as long as neither side approaches their work in the way that too many Americans approach their lifestyles. As long as researchers on each side focus on their own unique contributions, they need not be in conflict. But if they, like Americans, claim all for themselves and leave nothing for the other side, they create a zero-sum game such that one must win and the other lose. So I leave you with this challenge to pursue your way, your path, while honoring and leaving place for the other path as well. Thank you very much.
We have talk. just to explain, Philip specifically asked me not to get in a 25-minute signal, so we have more time for questions than you might think. We have about 14 minutes for questions, so there's lots of time for discussion.
Just take few observations.
Hello. Yeah, my
Yes,
comment.
and if you could keep your questions short, please.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. Like you, Dr. Clayton, I also have been very dissatisfied over the years with these conferences over the gap. But there are approaches, and I think the approaches on both sides must pick the right sciences and the right phenomenology to combine together. And in this particular thing, I want to present to you a journal called Neuroquantology, which is an online journal. And what it does is, so far in all the imaging and all the neuroscience, we've been looking at the brain classically. And this wants to look at the brain quantum physically. So there's a whole, wide ocean of difference between the reductionist way of looking at it and the holistic way of looking at it, non-locality and all that. But it requires that honesty. And in this journal, there are papers on near-death experiences, on all of those things, on mystical experiences, and quantum physical ways of explaining them. So we must start, I think, with the right thinking and right theorizing, and then formulate the experiments
Very
to
nice.
actually prove the other side. So it was a revelation for me, this neuroquantology, which, by the way, was chief editor is from Turkey, which is in the middle
Yes.
of Europe and Asia.
Oh, nice, nice. Conceptual analysis is like meditation or like phenomenology. One sees differences that are there if one pauses and looks carefully. So, for example, there are at least three different ways that we can make these sorts of proposals. The trouble with a lot of quantum explanations of the brain is that they present a final answer as if we have it. Did you hear that tone in Stuart Hameroff's talk, the very opening talk of this conference? We've got it, it's here. I mean, he and Penrose have been saying that since the beginning. Then on the far side, this is absolute certainty, I've got it and you're all wrong. On the opposite side is mystery. You should take my approach because it's the most mysterious of all. And there's something really interesting about biological explanations of the brain and its products. One is always grasping to tell a part of a story that she doesn't fully get. There's an open-endedness, a sense of correlations that we want to make tighter, but they aren't yet. And it's that experience that I would put forward as the humility that such difficult questions actually require. Thank you.
A few observations. We have to develop neurophysiology, neuropsychology and neurospirituality together. We have to take hints from the several yoga principles, yoga systems of India, where they speak of so many nadis, so many nals and so many dharas. There is the spiritual energy in the brain and in the spine. In the spine we have 6 chakras, and the chakras, and also we have in the grey matter and white matter also we have centers. And they are not physical. And there are 3 levels of it. Nerve center is there.
Could you keep your comments short?
Yes.
Yeah, very yeah.
The glials are there, the ganglia are there, and also the chakras are there. They are at 3 specific levels: the physical, the psychological, and also the spiritual level.
Yeah.
So we have to distinguish these things and then follow. And another thing is,
Okay, why don't you stop you there, because there are 6 more people to go.
Yes.
Okay, thanks very much.
One word. That is, the disciplines of Ayurveda and homeopathy should be taken into consideration along with modern medicine.
Thanks very much. Another thing that you recognize if you think closely about these questions is that there are certain types of phenomena that are amazingly clear and precise, and others recede from our understanding or from our language because of their difficulty or complexity. And not to acknowledge that ladder that recedes at the top, that mountain that recedes into the clouds, is to make claims for a type of certainty that can easily become dangerous. what's some of the most concrete? The scientists can help me. The Pauli exclusion principle that describes how the orbitals of an atom are filled. Extremely clear and precise and accurate. There are areas of solid-state physics where we have an accuracy to 8 significant digits. I mean, if you've done any biological work, you know that's plenty good, right? 8 significant digits. Then we have empirical tests in, say, neurology. Then we have psychology, where variance plays a larger role, right? Then we have the broader sort of psychological functions, like sense of well-being or worldview or general affect. But when you get to spirituality, I'm thinking of his term neuro-spirituality, shouldn't you expect that here a large dose of humility is called for? Not because it doesn't exist, not because it's false or meaningless, but because the questions are so profound and the truth so easily eludes us that to say this is the path as I see it, as I've experienced it, but not a scientific claim I am making, might be a wise response.
Professor Clayton, if I understand your proposal or proposition, it is to synchronize the epistemologies of science and spirituality. That's the essence of what you said today. But
synchronize, not identity, but
yeah,
bi-directional constraint.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. But, you know, the very essence of spiritual claims or spiritual enterprise is the very rejection of any epistemology whatsoever, especially in the terminal phase. So how do you see bridging this gap? That's question number one.
Oh, wait, that's... Okay, number 2. You wanted a second one, don't you?
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
That's a big
He's
question.
only going to give you one,
Only going to get one question.
Okay.
There's only 5 minutes left.
But to say that spirituality has nothing to do with epistemology runs roughshod over the Indian traditions, where epistemology and moksha, of salvation or liberation, are so closely intertwined that spirituality and scientific epistemology diverge. Should not be surprising. That we should accept, the scientist as well as the spiritual practitioner, right? But that's why my talk opposes identity, opposes unifying theories, grants the asymptotic relationship, asks for a humility that allows us to mind the gap, as they say on the London Underground, right? Mind the gap. Let it be, right? And so that the phenomenological experiences of the spiritual life and the distinct lifestyle of the scientific quest can exist without being forced together in an unnatural union.
I really like your way of putting things as neurophenomenology as a sort of marriage and bidirectional constraint, and the optimistic gloss you put on it. Sort of as in any marriage, and maybe this is why I'm not married, you know, it's not just a case of acknowledging the range and remit of the other and allowing it to exist, but one has to give stuff up too.
Yeah.
You have to give stuff up. And so I wonder how far can we push this view to say, okay, what kinds of things should each be prepared to give up, and how do I identify those? Because I can imagine, as a scientist, I'm willing to give up some intuitions about phenomenology, but how does that work?
Let me try. What the scientist has to give up, what the scientist has to give up is less expensive. It's less difficult than what it might be that the spiritual religious person has to give up. He has to give up absolutist claims, but that he shouldn't have had in the beginning. He has to give up nothing buttery, right? That the world is nothing but the techniques of my particular subdiscipline. But why would he have thought that in the first place, right? And he has to give up the claim that when a big question or a big concept arises, it's ipso facto meaningless. But again, that doesn't detract at all from the power of his data and his ability to test it. It just means that there are these realms which aren't currently testable by the means of his discipline. But that's not surprising at all. So I think, though my scientific friends often resist those four, they're not costly. The religious person has to give up certain epistemic claims in light of what science does and is, and in some cases certain beliefs. The latter is a very unpopular thing to say. But I'll just say, for example, it's my belief that to acknowledge the scientific method requires for Christians, especially as I know them in the United States, to give up certain kinds of miracle claims that God periodically sets aside natural law. Fortunately, in most Indian traditions, that's not, at least it's not a core problem. The epistemic one is the one, however, I've been emphasizing. To give up the claim that I have scientific verification for the inner states and knowledge. I have real reason for them. They are the core of my being, but they're not equivalent to science. Thanks. That's a great...
Okay, we have 3 minutes, shall we say. So
Right, I'll be brief with
roughly
it.
1 minute each, if you're being fair with each other.
I will not take too much of the time. I really congratulate Professor Clayton to be giving this very last talk of this conference, which has been an exciting one, because he put forward very clearly what I have felt all along myself as a physicist, that we must really mind the gap. This gap really exists, and this gap can only be bridged if an effort is made by both sides to clearly define what we want to understand and not really shove it under the bed. To give you just one example.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, well, I want to just give an
Because
example.
there's almost no time left.
Yeah, okay. Then I would not ask any question. Thank you.
Good. And I say that's beautifully put, and I could not say it any better, and I thank you for your comment.
I have a supplement to the asymptotic way of looking at the things.
A question?
And that is the windows and the doors approach. Windows are to look outside, and doors are to enter inside. So therefore, the Western science, or the methodology of the science, is the window approach, looking at reality outside. And the spirituality is entering inside the doors. So the Western windows, Eastern doors, that's the symbolism of the house of knowledge, that we need to complement both of them. And that is also the title of one of my books, which talks about the Western window approach to creation of knowledge and the Eastern door, the spiritual approach, and combining the two.
Beautiful.
To get a holistic perspective.
And shall we meet in the living room, have a cup of tea,
Yes, yes.
and explore the things that those of us with windows and those of us with doors can learn from listening to each other.
And there are corridors inside.
Yes.
Corridors inside to chat. That is the consciousness corridors.
Good, thanks.
A last quick comment.
Sorry, it's an unfortunate point to continue because such a beautiful line. But I just wanted to know, you listed some 26 or 36 definitions of consciousness over these 3 days. What is the phenomenological definition of consciousness?
Now that would not be humility, would it? So now that I've got the last word, the true nature of consciousness is...
Thank you very much, Philip Clayton.